Well, it would seem that in all cultures there is a very strong taboo on incest. It does seem to have a definite biological significance. I've discussed this in aspects of Buddhist morality, with a long quotation from Darlington. So I'll refer you to that. It would seem that the observance of the incest taboo does definitely have a biological and therefore a survival value. Yeah. So that's the taboo is so deeply built into human nature now that it is almost genetically impossible to violate it. You have such a deeply inbuilt resistance, to behaving in that particular way.
The second mean, where the practice was sex with men.
No, you've missed one. What was the second one?
Sex and anything like.
This is actually mentioned from time to time in Buddhist texts, and I believe other spiritual texts. I think that the significance of this simply is that the demand for sex is excessive, because the night time is considered the appropriate time for that, because it's generally considered a shameful activity, and therefore others shouldn't see, etc., etc. Yeah? So to be sexually active during the daytime, as well as during the night, is considered, a manifestation of extreme libidinousness, and therefore, from a spiritual point of view, certainly even an ordinary ethical point of view, to be reprehensible. And then?
Well, the third instance was sex with men.
I think this goes back, to ethnic values, because one does find this in all ethnic religions. You certainly find it in Hinduism. It seems to have been taken over from Hinduism, by Buddhism, or even taken over in the case of Tibetan Buddhism from the primitive Bon tradition. One finds it in Judaism and so on. Because in the early ages of history, when these ethnic religions were developed, it was extremely important to multiply the human race. That was necessary to survival. You needed as many hands as possible. You wanted to do nothing which would hinder, the production of human beings. So for this reason, various forms of contraception, were not even known, were not even devised at that time. And sexual contact with members of one's own sex is a means, one might say, of having sex without procreation. In a way, it's a form of contraception. You might say, this is why the other forms of sexual practice which are mentioned are considered taboo. Whereas they don't result in procreation. And this is why one might say, even within Christianity now, as a result of its Jewish heritage, certainly in, say, the Catholic Church, the only acceptable, form of sexual activity is within marriage and for the purpose of procreation. So that is the logical result of that sort of attitude. So it seems to have its roots there, in the requirements of the ethnic religions, due to the particular, cultural and social situation in which they found themselves. But the overall, sort of thrust, one might say, of Buddhist teaching on this subject is obviously to minimize, sexuality as such. And to cultivate affection, to cultivate the positive emotion of metta, which is quite sharply distinguished from sexual feeling. Quite sharply distinguished from prema and sineha in Pali. Because there's been a need to be careful, not to under-procreate, for a very, very long time. I don't remember when the human race reached the billion figure. When was it? It wasn't all that very long ago. So for hundreds of thousands, even for a few million years, there were, relatively speaking, just a handful of human beings. The human race was quite small in respect of numbers. So it became quite important, one might say, that individual human communities should safeguard their numbers. Everyone was interested in multiplying. If you were a father, head of a family, and you had 2 or 3 wives, and all those wives had, 5 or 6, 7 or 8 children, well, you had a whole sort of horde of people at your disposal. You could, cultivate more. You could, have more cattle, more sheep, more goats, whatever it was, more cows, more wealth. Or you had more influence, more power. So all that depended on population. And with regard to the larger groups, the more people there were, the more they could bring the surrounding countryside under their control, and so on. The more civilization was possible, the more culture was possible. But we've long ago reached a point where we don't have to think in terms of preserving the human race. It's the least threatened species of all. Apart from the atom bomb, of course. It's the other species that are threatened, by the human race. But for so many generations, were we accustomed to thinking in terms of procreation, that we can't help thinking in those terms even now. Our natural tendency is that way. So we tend also to think of sexual activity in those terms, or being for that particular purpose. Because if you were completely rational, I suppose you should just suspend sexual activity completely, because there's really not the need for it now that there used to be. But man not being a rational creature, and his emotions taking a long time to catch up with his intellect, well, we still have this rather old-fashioned habit of carnal copulation. But never mind, we'll grow out of it gradually. Well, I mean, some people no doubt do feel it's quite irrelevant to the requirements of the spiritual life, but here they are hampered with this particular need, or with this particular function. But perhaps after a few more 100 generations, people will be more genuinely angelic, let us say. Meanwhile, we're sort of intermediate. I mean, we might say, sex is like the appendix. It's something that doesn't really have any function anymore. We could just as well go on without it. Well, at least quite a few. You need some part of the human race to attend to the the business of continuing the human race, I suppose. But not everybody needs to be involved in that particular way. Perhaps there are too many of us anyway already. I mean, some do in fact argue that the comparatively high level of civilization and culture, even comparatively high standard of living in many of the Buddhist countries, was due to the fact that they had a large celibate, or at least non-procreating monastic community, which kept the population down, so that there was more than enough to go around for all. Population finally reached its optimum level. So we should accustom ourselves of thinking of perhaps of human nature being transformed quite radically in future generations. We can't force the pace, for the time being we have to bear, those who are concerned with spiritual life, bear this burden of sexuality. But never mind, future generations will be comparatively free from it.